We all want clean water, an abundance of natural wildlife, and a healthy and natural ecosystem for our children and their children to enjoy. But who benefits, and who pays the price? Recently, a number of agriculture and environmental groups came together to examine these and many other important issues. Join us as we examine the social and economic value of Saskatchewan's natural capital.
It's my pleasure to introduce to you our guest speaker for the evening, and I don't know that he needs a lot of introduction to this audience, but I'll give the relevant information anyways. Kevin Hirsch has been an agricultural journalist and broadcaster in Saskatchewan for nearly 30 years. I think Kevin said he graduated from agriculture in about 1980 and immediately went into media. He produces a daily commentary for a number of Saskatchewan radio stations, writes a weekly column for about 20 newspapers, and serves as editor for a bi-monthly magazine called Agri-Success Journal, published by Farm Credit Canada. As a consulting agrologist specializing in communications, Kevin also works on communication strategies for various organizations. Each year he speaks to scores of agricultural conferences and conventions, and I think he's here tonight and in Gainsborough tomorrow and in Saskatoon on Friday. Kevin and his wife Marlene run Hirsch Consulting and Communications from a home-based office in Saskatoon. They provide management services to Crop Production Week and to the Saskatchewan Outstanding Young Farmers Program. Kevin also serves as Executive Director of the Saskatchewan Mustard Development Commission and Canary Seed Development Commission of Saskatchewan. Kevin and Marlene own and operate a grain farm near Cabri in southwestern Saskatchewan, growing a wide variety of crops. I've known Kevin, I guess we're reminiscing at supper, since the mid-1980s, and I think I've sort of seen his career develop in that time period, where he's become somebody who's respected for his analytical abilities, for his fairness, and also for the fact that he really reflects the farm gate view at many times. And some of us from APAS were in Ottawa the last week of February in conjunction with the CFA meeting, and I was amazed in talking to CFA delegates from other parts of Canada about issues. They'd say, "Oh, I read this in Hirsch's column from your province." And we visited a number of MPs one afternoon, and at least two of them commented on issues we were raising with them. "Oh yes, I read Hirsch's column on this, and I agree with what he said." So I think Kevin's got a lot of influence in the world of agricultural media. And Kevin, we're glad to have you tonight as our guest speaker.
Well, thank you very much for those kind words, Niall. We're getting long in the tooth, you and I, and maybe some others in this room. But a whole bunch of informative, expert opinions during the day, and now you're stuck with a consultant and journalist for the evening program, and I apologize for that. Heard any good definitions of a consultant? How a consultant is someone that knows 101 ways to make love, but doesn't know any women. Or if you get a bull that tries to jump over a barbed wire fence and doesn't quite make it, what do you have? A consultant. So I was asked tonight to speak on social issues surrounding ecological goods and services. And, I'm glad I sat in through the day and made notes diligently and racked my brains about what I could tell you that might be of some use. So when you're given the topic of social issues, you can talk just about on anything you want. So I'll throw out some observations from the day and some ideas about what I think is happening in agriculture generally. And, since I'm just an agricultural journalist and broadcaster, I can be wrong. It's okay. I'm not an expert on anything. As Niall mentioned, I'm a journalist. I was writing a weekly column in the Regina Leader Post. They called me a couple weeks ago and said they couldn't afford me anymore with the troubles that are in the newspaper industry. I didn't really think that $50 a week was going to break their budget that bad, but c'est la vie. And it's surprising, actually. As mentioned, I do a daily radio commentary for a bunch of stations. But what I get more attention out of is I take the text from that radio commentary and I post it on my website. And the website has a subscribe button there, so people can subscribe, and it's emailed out to them whenever I post it to the website. Tomorrow's radio cast will be posted to the website sometime tonight. So if you want to do that, it's just hirsch.ca, and you can subscribe, and I find that gets the word out, and I get more reaction and that gets distributed farther and wider than a lot of the things I do for broadcast media, because the world is changing. Now, I haven't figured out how to make any money on that aspect of what I do yet. I'm still working on that. But what I do get is a lot of great feedback, because people get this in their email box, and they can hit reply and say, Hirsch, you're even stupider than usual tonight. Or, Hirsch, don't you know about this? Or you should check into that, or I agree or I disagree. And hey, that makes my life a whole lot easier when I can get that kind of feedback from people. So if you'd like to subscribe, I'd certainly invite you to do that. Now, since we're talking social issues, I thought I could get away with a family picture. And as you can tell, that one's a few years old now because I'm a lot grayer and the kids are older. But that's my grandpa and his brother. And there's some debate about this, but that's supposed to be the original tar paper homestead shack, which was added on to many times, and where I grew up near Cabri, Saskatchewan. So, when we talk about the social issues or the social side of ecological goods and services, we are still talking, for the most part, family farms in Canada, in the beef sector, and in the grains and oilseeds and specialty crop sector. Now, if you're in the hog sector, it's maybe a little bit different. Or if you're a cattle feedlot, maybe it's a little bit different. But we're still dominated by family operations, and that's not probably going to change. I told my grandpa actually hauled water for the town of Cabri with that rig for a while, according to the history book. And Cabri had 9 elevators at one point. When I was a kid, I can remember 3 or 4, and there is still, there's a few more structures than that. I guess there's 2 elevator structures there. There's only one actually taking grain, and that's even an accomplishment for a small town these days, is to have just one grain elevator, especially down in the desert down there. So this is the romantic notion that a whole lot of people have about agriculture. We've got an urban population that really doesn't have a clue. And what they think they know comes out of storybooks and old MacDonald's farm rhymes. And then they think that that milk in that pail has got to be better than what you buy at the store, because that's natural. Yeah, that's natural when the cow puts her foot in the pail. So, times have changed, but the attitudes of people and the general public haven't necessarily. And there was a time in the agriculture community when that was a hell of a good day's work. Hey, you're just out there making black summerfall. Yeah, let's get out there and rip it up. Recreational tillage probably helped marriages a lot, got the guy out of the house. And, times have changed, and we do things a little differently because, that was a picture from the 30s, but there's people in this room that from the southern part of the province that remember that from the 80s, when things were absolutely ugly in about 88, 89. And I don't think, and that was probably nothing like what the 30s were. If you go in parts of southern Saskatchewan where whole fence lines disappeared or whole hedges of carriganas disappeared in blow dirt around some farms, and you can still find binders buried 3 feet below the surface in some of those field edges, we've come a long way with some of our practices. Now, that being said, is that a better way to control weeds than that old cultivator? Well, if you ask somebody in urban Canada, they'd probably say, oh God, he's using chemicals. He's using chemicals. Tillage has got to be a lot better than that. And even within, the agricultural community, we'll have debate over these sorts of issues, won't we? And, things have changed and attitudes have changed. As a teenager, 13, 14, 15 years old, I can remember spending summers clearing this 20 acres of land that my dad just thought we had to farm. Because he'd bought this adjoining quarter, for $9,000, and it had 20 acres that wasn't broke, and it was too far away from the yard for our cattle to use it, and geez, he thought we could farm it. So we dug rocks till we looked like rocks. And yeah, we eventually, and this stuff, you could farm it, but after you got done going up and down it with a combine, you should probably go home and change your trousers, because it was really, really steep and scary. And we farmed it for many, many years, And equipment got bigger, and it was making less and less sense. And there was a big there's a big draw through the middle of it as well. And you know, a lot of springs, we don't have a lot of runoff. And my dad looked at that and said, you know, we can farm through that. And there was actually, you know, I don't come from pothole country like a lot of you guys do. I'm down in the desert. There was actually a natural tree in this gully, yeah? But we ripped that tree out and we broke it up and we tried to bring the sides down so we could farm through it, and we farmed through it for many years. Every year or every second year, it get some bad erosion and it got steeper, and those hills got stupider and stupider to try to bring big equipment on, and eventually, I had an epiphany, and there was a little government program that would subsidize grass seed one year, and we seeded it to grass. And do I get any revenue off it? No. Well, now and then the neighbor will haul some haying equipment over it and try to make some bales up in those mountains. So no, I don't, but probably save a whole lot of money by not putting farm inputs there and not wrecking equipment. So times have changed and thought processes have changed. And attitudes have changed about agriculture. This is Kevin and Melanie Bolt, friends of mine, outstanding young farmers from a number of years ago. They run Pine View Farms north of Saskatoon. And a number of years ago, they looked at the grain industry and said, geez, you know, it's a tough business to make any money in this grain business, but we got a chicken quota. We've always raised some chickens. We got a butcher shop. How about we raise all natural chickens? We'll get a provincially inspected abattoir, and we'll see if we can make a go of it, selling directly to people that want something all natural. And it's gone over marvelously. 70% of their business is people driving out to the farm because they want to look them in the eye who raised the chicken, and they believe because it saw the light of day for part of its life, it tastes better. And if they believe that, that's fine. And they're getting some of their neighbors to raise all natural beef and all natural pork, and they're selling that through their stores. And what they don't sell directly at the farm gate, they market to white table restaurants. And there's probably more opportunity for more people to do that, even in Saskatchewan. But in Saskatchewan, we are an export-oriented province, and certainly that's not an opportunity for everybody. If you're in Prince Edward County, Ontario, maybe it's going to be the prevalent form of agriculture. It won't be here, but it does show that attitudes in urban areas are changing, because I'm not sure that kind of a model for direct marketing would have worked 20 or 30 years ago in the same way. So I think people in urban areas care more about agriculture, but unfortunately, they really don't have a clue, most of them, about how things operate. This is a little bit on farm size, and I apologize, this is the last data we have. It's 2006 data. And this is gross sales across the bottom. So less than $25,000 a year in gross sales. Almost 40% of the farms in Canada reported gross sales of under $25,000, and the light blue is the percent of total receipts that represented. Let's express it a little different way, a little bit easier to understand. Less than $100,000 in gross sales back in 2006, 2/3 of the farms in Canada were at that size. 100,000 to $250,000, 17% of the farms. $250,000 to $1 million, 14% of the farms. Over $1 million in gross receipts, only 2.6% of the farms, but 40% of the total receipts represented by that category. Now those are 2006 numbers, and us guys in the grain industry think we're heroes now because grain prices have doubled or more than doubled, and so our gross receipts look a fair bit better than they would have back in 2006. But if you're earning less than $100,000 gross, what's your net? Or how many trips to Mexico are you taking if your gross sales is $100,000? Well, unless you're growing something that's very high margin and then probably illegal, you're not making much, if anything, on gross sales of $100,000 or less. And some people say, well, you know, that's the dinosaurs happening. Those small farms are going to disappear. And you know something? There's an element to that, but that's probably actually not the case. And I'll get to that in a minute. Here's it broken out by sector. And the dark blue is $250,000 to $1 million in gross sales. And the light blue is over $1 million. And you can see dairy farms comprise a lot of larger operations by gross sales. So do hog operations, so do poultry operations. There's field crops, quite a bit smaller, but the numbers now would be quite a bit bigger than that in gross sales, because what's happened price-wise, look where the beef industry is at. The beef industry is dominated by producers with very low gross sales. And, you know, it's not hard to figure. 100 cows is still a pretty good size herd in Saskatchewan. Anywhere in Canada. So let's say 200. Let's say you're selling 200 calves in the fall. You sold 200 calves last fall. What was your gross return? Harold, what was your gross return if you sold 200 calves last fall? Yeah, 90, 100,000, depending upon the weight. And that's gross. That's your gross sales for looking after 200 head of cows for a year with all of those expenses weighing you down. Is there any wonder that people are getting the hell out of cattle production? You know, that's about 4 semi-loads of lentils, you know, for those 200 cows. So, you know, the industry dynamics. So we all going to go big? We all going to go to this guy like a, 83-foot seed hawk or whatever that is? Or all the farms going to be 1,000 cows and all the grain farms going to be 5 or 10 or 15,000 acres? Well, certainly the trend is for commercial operations to get bigger and bigger. But they're not all going to get bigger. Now, if you're a hog producer, there's maybe not a whole lot of romance in raising a few hogs and losing money, so there's not very many small hog producers. There are fewer than 100 hog producers in Saskatchewan now. Now, there's more hog operations or facilities than that, but actually hog owners, even if you count the Hutterite operations, there's fewer than 100 in Saskatchewan right now. So the ma and pa operation in hogs has got the hell out of the business. But they still exist in the grain industry. They still exist in the beef industry to a big extent. And you'll always have somebody that wants to raise a few cows or mess around with a few quarters of land with dreams of getting bigger, or because they just like it or they like the lifestyle or they're willing to subsidize it with off-farm income, or because they're doing some direct marketing. And that's not going to change. In fact, the last census statistics out of the US indicates that trend exists down there too. More big farms, more small farms. It's actually the ones in the middle that are disappearing. They don't know quite how they fit into this new reality. And part of the deal that shows you that small farms are going to be around for a while is that how many producers report off-farm income, an increasing number. And this statistic is really telling. 20% of producers reported working more than 40 hours a week off the farm, but still call themselves farmers. And of course, the difficulty for policymakers is, what are you trying to do? Is your policy parameter trying to keep the maximum number of farmers on the land? Is that what we're trying to do? Is the policy parameter trying to keep small and medium-sized producers? Or is the policy to encourage efficient production no matter what the size? We haven't had that debate. In the US, the new president, Barack Obama, is trying to get legislation in place that would cap subsidy payments to farmers. Got pretty good public support to do that. I don't think he's going to get that through Congress. They're not going to give up, the big producers are not going to give up their share of the subsidy pie. They don't want to do that. And here we have the same debate. Should we cap farm programs? Many of them have caps already, but the caps are reasonably high, and probably, it's been difficulty in case and agri-stability for large cattle feedlots and large hog operations because they were way up over the cap and could only receive the cap in support. So it has been an issue for some here, but it's a policy discussion we tend not to have. And the age thing. This is the different census years starting in 91, ending in 2006, number of producers under 35 years of age. And here's producers over 55 years of age. Now, based on the discussions earlier today, I would assume that even in this age group there are still some breeding couples, but maybe not so many procreating couples. Okay, just to get this straight. I'm not in that age group yet, but I'd like to believe that when I get there, that it's not all over. So as I mentioned, I think the beef industry has had a terrible shellacking. We've lost a big chunk of the beef breeding herd. We've seen a lot of small to mid-sized producers say, what the heck am I doing this for anymore? And I'm 55 or I'm 60 or I'm 65 years old and I don't want to be feeding cows through the winter for nothing anymore. And the people that are doing it are probably going to be larger and have more cattle. They're probably going to try to cut their winter costs, their feeding costs, and make those cows do as much of their own work as possible in trying to forage and get that leftover stockpiled forage out of the snow. This is Christoph and Erica Weider, outstanding young farmers from a few years ago. And Christoph writes a really interesting column in Grain News, and he's an interesting character. And they're doing some specialized marketing. And he's got some real ideas about how the beef industry should evolve. And there will always be a beef industry in Western Canada, just a question of how vibrant and how many producers there will be. And over the years, there's been lots of government programs aimed at getting marginal grain land out of grain and into grass and pasture. And what's going to happen now when we've got fewer and fewer cattle guys out there? Do you think some of that hayland might be broke up again? We're going to repeat some of those mistakes from the past? When we talk about ecological goods and services and doing the right thing, well, right now we could have used that kind of a program to try to retain more of that land in its appropriate use. Because in my view, through the 70s especially, we made all sorts of mistakes, and we broke up a whole pile of land that should never have been trying to grow grain with. And we kept at it, and we kept at it, and you know, through the 80s and through the early 90s, when the grain industry was really ugly, we were putting more and more of that land back to grass. And we said, beef, you know, we're a landlocked nation, we should have an advantage in beef. And along came BSE, and along came fluctuations in the value of the Canadian dollar, and along came country of origin labeling, and a whole lot of other issues. And the beef industry, I really believe, is really on the ropes, and that's probably, you know, an ecological disaster in many respects. I like this slide. You may not. I'm a skeptic. I'm sorry, you know, and I know if you show this to scientists, and you know, I use this at a meeting of people doing statistical analysis on climate one time, and they were just aghast that anybody could doubt this whole greenhouse gas global warming theory. Okay, have you paid attention to the winter we just had? You know, so I don't know. You know, and the scientists don't agree. Most scientists say, yeah, we're warming, we think. Are we? Well, now somebody else will say, oh no, those numbers are wrong. And I don't think they've really drawn a real close link between greenhouse gas emissions and warming. I'm a skeptic. Okay? Now a lot of people say, oh, that's a heretic. That's heresy. You know, that's a terrible thing, you know, to doubt that. You know, the world is flat, damn it, and you're just going to have to live with it. So, you know, I don't know. I don't have the scientific base to sort through all the arguments. But just some things just don't seem to add up. Now you can bet that if we'd have had the warmest winter in the past 10 or 20 or 30 years, that would have been pointed out as proof positive of global warming. Since we had the coldest winter in 10 or 30 or 40 years, that doesn't matter. That's just an anomaly. And somehow, even with all this climate change, we grew the biggest crop in the world had ever seen last year. Climate change happening globally, but we can grow bigger crops than we ever did. Well, there's other factors involved there as well. Be that as it may, whether it's greenhouse gases, whether there's climate warming, how the two are related, whether it's sunspot activity, whatever the case, we're well along this policy line of reducing carbon emissions. And there's a whole lot of other really good reasons why that's good policy. You know, reduction of fossil fuel use, carbon sequestration, cleaning up, it can't be a bad thing. And it's not going to be like the Y2K fiasco, where everybody said that on the stroke of midnight in the year 2000, you better not be in an airplane because it's going to fall to earth and the electricity isn't going to work, so you better have 3 weeks worth of supplies and a generator in your house. And there's some people that doubted that, and other people say, well, there might be some glitches. So what happened? What happened when 1 minute after midnight? Not a damn thing happened. Climate change isn't going to be like that, is there? We're never going to know for sure whether we're right or whether we're wrong or how these are related. So this policy bus that's happening around the world might get delayed by things like economic crises, but that bus is going to continue. And we've hitched our wagon to it with things like carbon trading and ecological goods and services. The whole world is now in this mold, and rightly or wrongly, that part is probably not going to change. Now, something else I have to admit to being a skeptic about, and again, you'll say this is heresy, and again, there's learned people in this crowd that over a drink later that they buy me, they can tell me the error of my ways. But wildlife. You know, there's probably wildlife species that are endangered. But wildlife in total, I don't think we've ever had more wildlife in Saskatchewan, certainly in my lifetime, and I bet in yours in many areas. And in many cases, it's a problem. You know, there's so many coyotes that clean up all your cat population around yards. You know, the geese. I find moose. I see moose, even when I'm not drinking, at Cabri now. And if I'd have told you that 20 years ago, you'd have put me in a rubber room. We've got more white-tailed deer running around. You know, people view them as a big problem. And, you know, my pet theory, well, we don't have a bunch of kids out there with guns that want to shoot everything that moves on every half section like we used to have. And we've got a whole bunch of abandoned farmyards that provides habitat that we didn't used to have. So that's just my pet uneducated theory. So certainly we've got some wildlife issues, and I'm certain the people would like to see more potholes and more duck population. So I'm not saying this, you know, blanket that everything is right, but not everything has gone to hell in a handbasket on the wildlife front and on the environment front in Saskatchewan either. So observations from the day. On the whole carbon trading issue, and there's people in this room that know much more about what's likely to come than I, but one of the problems I hear about, and I hear about this, Gary, through some of the people with Saskatchewan Soil Conservation Association, is that we haven't seemed to got over this whole business as usual problem. In other words, we've got a whole bunch of farmers in Saskatchewan that have been direct seeding for 5 or 10 years, and you're going to draw a line in the sand and say, well, since you've been doing this for so many years, you don't get any carbon credits because it's no change in what you're doing. So that was business as usual. And any benefit from that we'll take as a government. You don't get that. Well, that's a real good policy. So what should I do? I should buy or borrow a cultivator and rip up the land so I'm starting from square one so I get the subsidy like everybody else that's just starting now in direct seeding for carbon sequestration. What a strange, strange policy that is. And then there's liability issues. You know, who's liable for this? You know, if I collect carbon credits for a number of years and then from some strange stroke, somebody, me or some subsequent buyer goes and rips it up, if that's still their right to do that, and releases that carbon, who has liability for that? Do we have to put an easement on the land that nobody can ever do that? Or are we just renting these carbon credits? Or, you know, producers aren't going to be too anxious to do this if they have the liability on a go-forward basis. So the carbon credit picture is very confusing. The feds keep making noises. Alberta has come out with a program, although you look at the details of the Alberta program and what they consider minimum tillage is, you know, about one step above summer fallow in some instances. They allow a whole bunch of exceptions and really wide openers, and I don't understand how their program works, but some people say that's what the feds are going to adopt. Okay, well, that's interesting. Here in Saskatchewan, there's a bunch of us have signed into, you know, the voluntary program that was put together by Sea Green aggregators, and that looked like there might be a little bit of money there until voluntary carbon went down to about $2 a ton on the Chicago Exchange, and now we're wondering whether we should be in that program or whether we should have held out for some sort of big federal program that might be coming down the line. So we've got nothing but confusion out there. And, you know, producers now are to the point where they've heard enough of this carbon credit stuff. They sort of have an inkling, most of them, about what that might be about. But if you start saying them ecological goods and services, you say ecological goods and services on Coffee Row in small town Saskatchewan and see how many blank looks you get, or how many people just think you're showing off. You know, so we got some work to do with that yet. But the whole carbon thing, as I view it, and other people express that opinion here today, it could be a big driver in a larger push of ecological goods and services. Because governments have limited dollars. But if there's a system in place where industry needs agriculture for offsets, you know, that's a whole new source of funding that, of course, everybody wants to salivate over. So even though it's really, really murky, it's no doubt very important to this discussion moving forward. But who designs the program? At this point, the feds have been meddling away, and it's hard to know what they're doing, and feds and provinces have been discussing various things, and, you know, well, there's one type of program you could have from bureaucracy, or we could let the scientists design the program. Well, that sounds really good, but scientists don't often agree very well either, and, you know, they just like to keep studying things. Or you could let farmers design the program. Well, we might be able to agree on that, but I'm not sure maybe the general public would like exactly what we design or not. So obviously there's still some work to do in this area. I was really interested with Ian's observations on AgriFlex. I was sitting there wondering what the heck they're going to do. You know, $500 million sounds like a lot of money over 5 years across the country. Boy, that stretches things pretty thin. And just to be clear, a bunch of that isn't new money. It's reallocated money out of a cost of production payment program that was never followed up on. And that's, so I think there's $192 million. And they have not a clue what they're going to do with it, as I understand it, except it can't be used for business risk management programs. They don't seem to want to just give it to the provinces to do whatever they want to do with it. So that's a really interesting observation that, you know, that could start to power an ecological goods and services program. That does make this a very interesting juncture in history. Other little things that come up. Paid hunting. I don't know what the rules are in Manitoba. I got the impression you could charge. My understanding in Saskatchewan is you can't legally charge for hunting. Now, there's other ways around that, I guess. Not that I would know this or anything. But, and maybe there's other ways. It's been suggested that there's been discussions, but this should be rolled into other things. But, you know, when there's a marketplace exists for some of this stuff already, that really is very much what we're talking about with ecological goods and services, I don't know why we don't necessarily, you know, look at letting the marketplace figure it out. Putting value on existing practices. Now, I mentioned the debacle that would happen if you told people that had been direct seeding all these years that they aren't part of the gravy train. But then Orrin Bayless asked the question, he said, well, what about me with my, you know, native prairie, running cows on it? You're not going to support me to do that? And that's where all these things get dicey, is in the details. And probably if you're running cows and you're running them the same way as your dad and your grandpa did, just kicking some cows out there and bringing them back in the fall, no, you probably, even though it's native prairie, you probably shouldn't get anything. Now, if you're doing a bunch of cross-fencing and holistic management and time-controlled grazing and doing some management practices, well, maybe then, you know, that makes sense to make that part of some sort of ecological goods and services and pay for things that people are already doing right. And if we wait till we got the perfect program, we'll never have a program. And I think Ian also made that comment, and others did as well. You have to start somewhere. Maybe you're going to have some wrong turns, but you better keep it simple. You better keep it logical so it can be easily understood with some pretty clear objectives. And then at some point, you just got to go. And there's going to be somebody that has their goat gourd and not going to be happy about it. That's what happens when you have to make policies. But if we don't start somewhere, it'll never happen. Just wanted to run through some farmland numbers, because I think this is relevant to this sort of discussion. Back in '71, when they were paying people not to grow grain under the Lower Inventories for Tomorrow program and things were really depressed, the average acre in Saskatchewan was worth only $59. And then Russia come in and bought up a bunch of grain from Canada and the US in what's termed the Great Russian Grain Robbery. People looked around and stocks-to-use ratios were really tight. People worried about whether there was going to be enough grain to go around. And grain prices spiked to unheard-of levels in the early 70s. We had a couple of years with over $1 billion in realized net farm income in 1970s dollars. And for the next decade, land prices rose faster than they've ever risen, and you didn't have to be a very good farmer, you just had to own some dirt and your banker liked you a lot because your net worth kept rising. What happened in the early 80s? There's people here that will remember interest rates of 15 or 18 or 20%. Who has the best story of interest rates? Anybody higher than 20%? 25%. In 25%, your principal more than doubles in 3 years. That's just ugly. Compare that to today where money is on sale. Money's on sale. Go get yourself some. 3, 4, 5%. You know, a person should lock in some of that. Probably won't get better, but those high interest rates of the early 80s and some shorter crops and then some downturn, you know, we were pretty good. There's our peak. Early 80s up to 82, that was the peak. That's the highest it's ever got statistically, 413. But for the next decade after that, land prices dropped steadily. Now you look at that and say, oh, that's terrible. Well, I think my mutual funds dropped more than that last year. You know, so that's, you know, that was over a period of a number of years, but it shows that land prices can go up, can go down. Mid-90s, we hit some pretty good grain prices again for a while, and people thought, here we go, it's the 70s all over again. That was pretty short-lived. They got rid of the grain transportation subsidy. We had some of that Crow buyout money in our pockets. So when you got money in your pocket and you're a farmer, you either buy iron or dirt. So that added some cost, you know, to the system. Saskatchewan Wheat Pool went public in the mid-90s. Somebody sold their shares for $22. I don't know who that was. One person did, but somebody else, you know, other people sold some shares pretty, you know, there was some money around. So land prices started increasing, have been increasing quite slowly since then. The last statistic that is available from Statistics Canada is for 2007, a pretty good increase. And I think by all accounts, the increase going into 2008, when those numbers are finally available, will be a fair bit greater than that. And we can probably say with some certainty that we now have the highest prices we've ever had in Saskatchewan for farmland. And these are averages. You know, this might represent the price in my neck of the woods. What's the highest land price you've heard in Saskatchewan? I hear some $1,200 stuff and some $1,300, and I heard 1 or 2 cases even way the hell and gone over that. But some of the nice stuff around Regina and some stuff northeast of Saskatoon and in that west central country here and there, you hear some $1,200 and $1,300 an acre stuff. But we're not that high compared to other provinces. Which province has the highest farmland price? Very good, Ontario. And that's their average. Now if you're at Thunder Bay running some beef cows, that price looks way the hell and gone over what your land is worth. But that looks pretty cheap if you've got a vineyard down in, you know, Niagara on the Lake or something. So they're all over the map, but even some of their good soybean and corn ground is pretty darn valuable stuff. And you talk about policy intervention, and I don't know a lot about this, and there'll be other people in the crowd know more than I, but have you heard about the Green Belt program? Greater Toronto area is surrounded by something that they instituted a few years ago called the Green Belt, which means you have to use it for agriculture. You can't sell it for development. And the people in Toronto think that's a hell of a deal, you know, because we can drive a little ways out of Toronto and there'll always be farms there now. And you think, well, farmers would like that, eh? If you're a farmer there, would you like that? Seems like a great plan until suddenly you can't sell it for development anymore. The government just says you got to sell it for agricultural use, and agricultural use right near a big city is not a whole lot of fun. It's not a fun place to farm. So, you know, their land values are being artificially held down. So farmers really don't like it just a whole lot. And then you get development that actually leapfrogs the green belt and goes beyond the green belt and sets up. So you're going to be sandwiched on both sides. So they're just, because, you know, these are government interventions. And that was a provincial one. So don't think that, you know, we're the only ones that are affected by what's happening in the world. Another thing that's interesting is, you know, with what's happening in the Ontario manufacturing belt and what's happening with their economy in Ontario, you wonder whether that will have an effect on farmland prices, because it'll probably take some of the pressure off, some of the industrial pressure off of their land prices. Well, that's fine unless you've got loans that are secured by land, and dropping land prices then, just not as much fun as it might be when you're dealing with your lending institution. BC is second statistically, and of course a great variation between land up in the Peace River area versus land in the Fraser Valley. Quebec, they've been pretty stable the last number of years. If you go back about 10 years ago, their land prices spiked for a couple of years because of their nutrient management policies. They put in a new law that said if you have a dairy or if you had a hog farm, you got to have enough land to spread that manure on. Either an agreement or you got to own it. So that put pressure on a lot of those livestock operations to go out and buy land so they had enough land tied up to spread their manure on. There's Alberta's numbers. Of course, it's skewed heavily with population pressure and development. The land prices are crazy along that Highway 2 corridor from Edmonton to Calgary down to Lethbridge. You know, it isn't agriculture, it's all the wannabe farmers, all the wannabe ranchers, all the wannabe cowboys coming out of Calgary, coming out of Edmonton. Everybody wants to own an acreage and run a few horses. And, you know, that's fine. You can farm there if you want to, but God help you if you're looking to expand. And you go tell your banker you want a loan to buy $3,000 or $4,000 an acre land to run some cows on. Yeah, that cash flows really well. And a lot of those folks came to Saskatchewan, where land was cheaper. Yeah, well, now they're wondering what the heck they did that for when Alberta come out with a $350 million subsidy program for its livestock industry over the past year. And we anteed up a little bit in Saskatchewan, but certainly not those magnitude of dollars. Manitoba, well, they got some pretty good ground there, less pressure from industry and population, pretty good ground, and that's why their land prices are also higher than Saskatchewan's. But as you can see that, you know, if you want to affect farmland use, you can probably do it easier in Saskatchewan and Manitoba than you can in some other provinces, because $20 or $30 or $50 an acre suddenly becomes pretty significant compared to your total value of farmland. Not as significant if you got land that's worth $4,000. Been a great deal to talk about ethanol, and I won't go into ethanol. It is one of the drivers in grain prices. The other driver we tend to forget about is the developing nations. And this is China, imports and exports of soybeans up until the mid-90s. China was actually a net exporter of soybeans. Since the mid-90s, China has become an increasing destination for soybeans and a whole lot of other products. And so is India. And there's a worldwide economic crunch, but those countries' economies are still expected to grow by not double-digit, but high single digits. And yeah, they're feeling some of the downturn too. But this has really changed the supply-demand complex in the world. This is a slide borrowed from the Canadian Wheat Board. This is wheat, corn, and rice ending stocks overlain with the population line. You can see back in the 70s, the ending stocks were not burdensome compared to the population line. In the 90s and early 2000s, the ending stocks of these grains were pretty burdensome compared to the population line. And now we're back to a relative shortage. And even though we produced a really big crop last year, the stocks-to-use ratios on grains, oilseeds, and specialty crops around the world are really not very onerous from an historical perspective. That's spring wheat prices on the Minneapolis Exchange, and a little over a year ago, you can see that spring wheat peaked at $25 a bushel. Now, a lot of that was speculative money. I am told that if you had locked in your prices here in Canada on the right day with one of the Wheat Board's producer payment option programs, you could have locked in over $20. And of course, not very many of us were smart enough to act on just that right time, because everybody thought things can only go higher, eh? But that was an interesting time. Things got pretty wild last year on tight stocks-to-use ratios. I always look to see, you can tell who runs John Deere combines in a crowd because they wince as soon as they see that. Somebody emailed me these quite some time ago under the heading, How to Cook a Deer. My point in showing this is that what's hot can get pretty hot, and they can get damn hot in a hurry. And I think, I've never been one for, I've never been really bullish on the grain industry, but I'm pretty bullish longer term on the grain industry. I'm not saying it's going to happen in 2009, but when you look at stocks to use ratios, and you look at eventually this world should come out of the economic problems it is, and even with the economic problems, grains and oilseeds are stronger than many other commodities and many other markets, and with growing markets in India and China, and with high prices for things like potash, that's going to affect production in countries like China, with credit availability problems in places like Brazil, Argentina, Russia, Ukraine, Kazakhstan, I think this whole grain business could be reloading for a big bull run if all the conditions converge. And so when we talk about ecological goods and services, there's a whole lot of interest when you're a struggling dirt farmer not making much dollars and somebody says, you know, we might be able to pay you for protecting some riparian areas, or for continuing to go around that slough, or maybe where there's a few dollars for carbon credits if we play our cards right. But you know, that could be dwarfed, at least for a short time, if the grain industry does go on this bull run. And you know, I'm not saying this is necessarily a good thing long term. You can get a lot of dislocation, a lot of bad things can happen if wheat goes to $25 or $40 or $45 a bushel. And you might say, oh, that'll never happen. Well, in 1971, the price of a barrel of oil and the price of a bushel of wheat were both $1.50. And oil went to $140 and people were still buying it. You're going to tell me that if wheat goes to $140, they're not going to buy wheat? So these things that we've previously thought as impossible are no longer impossible. And we are seeing volatility and unpredictability like we've never seen before. So ladies and gentlemen, that's about the end of my wisdom, I'm afraid. When Niall was, we were chatting over lunch, he reminded me of a story. He was telling about his formative years when he learned how to drink in the Bank End bar, the booming metropolis of Bank End. And it reminded me of the story of this traveling salesman that went into a bar in small town Saskatchewan, and he ordered a drink. He ordered a beer. And he brought him, and it was only $1. Well, that's pretty neat. So he ordered a Rye and Coke. Bartender bought it, and it was only $1. So he ordered a Caesar. And the bartender brought it, and it was only $1. And he says, wait a minute, what's going on here? You know, I know this is small town Saskatchewan, but only $1 a drink? What's going on here? Well, the bartender said, I'm also the owner of this place, and I went away and I made my millions in the oil industry in Alberta and then in Saudi Arabia, and this is my hometown. I always wanted to own the bar, and I got lots of money, and just does my heart good to be able to see people come in here and, you know, have a drink at only $1. Wait a minute. There's a table of guys over there, and all the time I've been here, they haven't had a drink. If this wasn't some sort of trick, they'd be drinking if drinks are only $1. And the bartender said, oh, well, you got to excuse them. They're Saskatchewan farmers, and they're waiting for happy hour. Ladies and gentlemen, thanks very much for listening. Thanks very much for having me. Appreciate it.
Thank you, Kevin. My name's Joel Peterson. I work with Ducks Unlimited. I do their industry and government relations work. And on behalf of the organizers, we appreciate you taking your time, coming down to the symposium, and giving us a little bit more to think about at the end of the day. A quick thank you to the sponsors. And the sheet's supposed to be up here. They'll be flipping throughout the day. And the last thing I needed to tell everybody is I'll meet you in the bar next door. So thank you and have a good evening.